Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today, as we near the end of the year, it is time for me to start looking back over my favourite books from the year. And particularly, this one is going to be around non-fiction books. There'll be a separate fiction list coming as well. Non-fiction's always, well, I always think it's easier to do because I, tend to read more fiction than non-fiction. But actually looking at the list, I got it down to about 30 at one point. And I was like, right, now to decide from the 30 who makes the final 12. The number 12 is arbitrary. It could literally be any number, but 12 feels like just the right level before it tips into absurdity, where it just becomes list every book you read. So here we go. Here are the 12. And yeah, it's been a great year for non-fiction. My general rules on this are there is a slight grace period to books released last year, particularly if they were late last year. But for the most part, I'm trying to focus on books that were released this year. And so with that, let's get started. First up is a book that I read right at the beginning of the year, and that is Letty McHugh's The Book of Hours. And it sells itself as a sort of an almanac, but essentially the core idea is this sort of patchwork of bits of writing that are Letty McHugh thinking about illness and energy and connection and all these sorts of things. And a big part of that is because of sort of chronic health conditions that she has. And so she uses this book as the sort of springboard to talk really a bit more about how we have sort of historically perceived illness or perceived periods of rest or perceived whatever else that's sort of linked to it. And what kind of comes out as a result is this really beautiful book that really made me stop and think and really sort of hit me quite profoundly right at the beginning of the year when it was sort of cold and dark as well. But a book that really looks at the ways that we approach things around rest, and particularly how we often think about sort of what we need to do as humans, and sort of almost kind of acknowledging or kind of picking away at the heart of that assumption that if we are always meant to be productive, what does that mean for people who, because of chronic health conditions or what have you, can't be productive, quote unquote, in the same way? And I just thought it was also really beautiful. It just sort of touches on lots of sort of, sort of collections of her finding things and really reveling in the wonder and joys of life. And I just thought this was a really beautiful book, and one that sort of stuck with me since the beginning of the year as well. I just think it's a gorgeous, gorgeous book. Next up, another book I read fairly early into the year, and that's Rebecca Fogg's Beautiful Trauma. And so this is a sort of part memoir, but also part kind of sort of scientific discovery in some ways. So essentially, Rebecca Fogg was involved in an accident that essentially meant that her hand was really sort of injured, and basically she lost most of its feeling and use. And what this then does is sort of transform that into a wider narrative around what she can do next. So it's her sort of reconstructing her relationship to her hand, her kind of going through various surgeries and therapies to regain use of her hand, but also at the same time her discussing what the science is behind that. What is the science? What does the science tell us around what we know about nerve endings or feeling or sensation or what have you? What does science have to tell us about the healing process? And also what's really noticeable about this is she spends so much of the book really looking at her sort of rehabilitation into the life she had before. That life has in many ways changed. She has gone from being somebody who was doing a sort of very high-powered job to not necessarily always being able to work. She would sort of feel good in herself but couldn't type easily or what have you. And so all of these things are sort of her way of tracing through that and kind of acknowledging that the power that came from that, the lessons that she learned along the way from having been through such trauma and such a kind of an incident. So I just thought this was a really interesting book, and she speaks so passionately and interestingly about it as well. So I find it just really fascinating as a way of blurring that kind of traditional memoir structure. It's not just the history of an incident that happened to her, but a wider discussion and a wider scientific investigation into the hand and how humans feel things, which I just thought was really well handled. And pun unintended, really sort of managed very, very well and very clever, I thought. Sticking with memoirs here, next up is Julian by Fleur Pierets, and translated by Elisabeth Khan. And this is a book that I've had also the privilege, I should say, of meeting Fleur a couple of times since the book came out, and it was just such a joyous experience to meet her, to talk to her a bit about the book, but also just hear sort of a wider story about her life. Essentially, the core idea or sort of premise of this book is Fleur was married to a woman called Julian, and they had this really beautiful relationship that was founded as well on kind of art and creativity and all of these various things. And part of that protest art for them was to then go and get married in every country where at the time same-sex marriage was legal. And they built up, they sold all of their belongings. They built up this whole plan to go and visit all of these countries and get married. After the fourth wedding, Julian started to feel quite unwell, and it suddenly sort of became quite apparent that she was suffering from a terminal illness. And what that then meant was that her, Fleur's whole life has been sort of completely upended, because within a short period of time, Julian was then unfortunately passed away. And that is then sort of Fleur's, this book then sort of charts Fleur's path to trying to understand herself a bit better, and trying to navigate what it means to live apart from somebody who you've just spent so much time with, and whose life was so enmeshed with your own, and where you've sold all of your belongings, you've sold everything, you're completely rebuilding a life, but this time alone. And I think Fleur just writes so powerfully about loss and grief, and what that looks like. But there's so much hope and beauty in the way that she imagines a future, and particularly how that future is informed by a hope around politics as well, that things will change. And since the book was originally published in its sort of native language, what's happened since has been that more countries have legalized same-sex marriage. And so what that really means as well is that, there's a sort of growing movement that Fleur is also so passionate about in terms of thinking about next steps. I just think it's a really beautiful book that explores grief and loss and hope in such varied and rich and thoughtful ways. And I really think it's a little mini sensation. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous book. On a similar but also very different note, we have Diarmuid Hester's Nothing Ever Just Disappears. And this takes this idea of memoir and particularly remembering the past in a very interesting and different way. So what it does is it focuses on particularly the lives of famous queer people, but told through their locations. So what Diarmuid does is basically explore various areas and various places that were really pivotal to certain celebrities and certain communities that were kind of emerging around them. So, for example, he starts the book and ends the book with a place that's really dear to my heart, which is Dungeness, where Derek Jarman was, where he lived and where he had this beautiful little cottage. And in many ways, that sets up so much else of what's to come with this book, because he talks so passionately in this book about the various scenes that created the conditions where people were able to live these rich and varied lives. So he looks at one point at Paris being a central place for so many figures. So Josephine Baker appears in this book, as does James Baldwin. We also have the people who kind of were responsible for publishing Ulysses, the sort of group of queer women who lived in and around Paris and, really moved the literary scene forward. And it's just this really fascinating way of approaching queer history, which is to really look at it through the lens of place. And that, it seems, I'm sort of reading it, I was almost staggered that nobody had really done that in a way that I'd seen, at least, like this, because it's such a fascinating way of approaching, what were the conditions that allowed people to really live their truest lives. I think it's also just a really stunning way of looking back over queer history and the history of communities who have been subjugated in various ways, because it sort of shines a light on the fact that some of these places were both these glitzy, glamorous places that were vanguards and sort of pioneers of specific movements, but also some of them were places where, you know, the opposite could be true on a different day, and how people's lives were so dependent on what was happening around them. And so I just think it's a really, really brilliantly thought out book that I just found fascinating on every page. It's a great, great read. Next up, we have a book that deals with memory in a very, very different way, and that is Wish I Was Here by M. John Harrison. And I did a separate video talking a bit about what this book says about memory and what that means. But this book sort of sells itself as an anti-memoir, and in many ways it operates like one too. It's a book that is intentionally quite slippy and tricky in many ways. It deals with the idea that we are not always the best narrators of our own lives, in the sense that we think we remember how our lives have panned out, and we think we remember everything that's happened, but we often remember a specific story or a specific narrative around it. And we were there, but often we were also in some ways not there. We didn't see other people's reactions, or we didn't understand what was going through someone's head when something happened. And so this book really explores the idea of memory in what I thought was a really fascinating way of digging into the various complicated factors that go into making a memory, that sometimes humans, we sort of have a tendency to just sort of think that there is a very clear-cut reason. You know, we look back on something 20 years later and think, oh, well, you know, all of this happened, so this thing could happen. But actually those events were entirely unrelated. And we are just sort of looking back and forging connections where they didn't always exist. And so in this memoir, or anti-memoir, M. John Harrison writes quite a lot about those exact things. You know, how we come to think about memory in really complicated ways. And he has what he, you know, he has this sort of notebook, which he calls a nout book, which is often jotting down various thoughts and sort of disconnected ideas. And for him, part of the game is then trying to reconstruct them and put them together. But sometimes it's also that you look at these memories and they mean absolutely nothing in later life or much later on, that they've never really meant much. Those sorts of, you know, the comparison I often thought of when I was reading this book is, I have a memory cupboard where I, for a while, would sort of very assiduously put in items that I thought I would remember forever, sort of as a way of looking back. And I remember at one point opening the cupboard and looking and finding something and just being like, what on earth was this? Why did I think that this was important? And even after a while of thinking, when I sort of jogged my memory and vaguely remembered what it was about, I figured that I didn't really need it anyway, that actually that memory felt really important at the time, and in the long, you know, in playing the long game didn't mean anything at all. And so I think this book really pokes at some of those things in such a fascinating way. I mean, it's quite daring, I think, in its approach in talking about memory and how we construct it. Terrible transition here, but talking of constructing, the next book is Constructing a Nervous System by Margo Jefferson. And this is a book that I thought was just such an interesting one in many ways. It made me think, in many ways, when I was reading Nothing Ever Just Disappears by Hester, it reminded me a lot of this book as well, in that they're both doing quite fascinating things with exploring various specific people in culture, and actually both reference Josephine Baker. But in Constructing a Nervous System, Margo Jefferson uses what feel at first like sort of bios of various figures from history, and particularly black figures in US history often as well, and what their identities and what their sort of struggles meant for her as a young woman, particularly. And so we get people like Etta James turn up, and there's something about the way that she relates to these characters, or real people, but how she relates to the public persona of them, that is so fascinating. It's sort of both a a biography talking about some of these big figures, but it's also her constructing her own identity. It's her way of basically saying, here's how I navigate the world as a black woman, particularly in the US. And so I just think it's fascinating. It's a really clever and thoughtful book, and very thought-provoking. I thought that it plays with so many ideas of how we come to make an identity, and how influential some of those icons and figures are for almost giving permission to be a certain way or to understand yourself in a certain way. And so I just thought this was really cleverly done, and it's a book that has lingered in my brain ever since. Next up, The Escape Artist by Jonathan Freedland. And this is a true story of a man, Rudolf Werber, who managed to escape Auschwitz and used that as a way of basically getting out to tell the story of what was happening to the sort of general public who knew nothing about this. And in many ways, as a result, sped up the closure of some of these concentration camps. And it's fascinating because this book is, you know, in many ways, it's a fairly straight retelling of a story of something that really happened, but it's told almost in a novel-like way. And so even though you sort of know what the end result will be, just because of the title of the book, it reads almost like an action or a thriller book at times. And then the crushing realization keeps happening that this was real, that you're not reading some kind of fictional tale. In fact, these people did go through some absolutely atrocious and horrendous things, not just in the concentration camps themselves. And I think this book serves as a really interesting and useful reminder of the horrors that were committed in concentration camps. But it also takes that and explores what actually the general public outside were thinking, or what the average person who encountered somebody fleeing might think, or what, how the soldiers treated them. All of these things kind of come together in this really powerful book, I think, talking about just some really horrendous things. But there's something quite special about the way that you are allowed to connect with Rudolf Werber himself. And he's this sort of, sort of gallant and sort of, for warrior kind of like figure in many ways, but then he's also somebody who, when he gets home, has this really complicated family life, because the idea of how you then readjust to the real world after a concentration camp is something that we often don't really consider in quite the same way. And so I think this book does a really interesting job in painting a full human portrait of Rudolf Werber, and not just as the person who did this, but we see his faults, we see what he's like as an everyday man outside of this as well. I just think it's so interestingly done as a book. Keeping with a dark tone, I guess, Show Me the Bodies by Peter Apps. And this is, I think, quite a remarkable book in many, many ways. It is a almost blow-by-blow sort of reconstruction and understanding and investigation into what happened at the Grenfell Tower. And for those of you outside of the UK who may be less familiar with this was big news in the UK a few years back. Essentially, there was a tower block with sort of hundreds, if not thousands, of people who lived there in London that caught fire. And the fire was made significantly worse. A fire by itself is a tragedy, but what sort of came out increasingly as the sort of in the aftermath of this incident was finding out that not only were the fire exits not properly sort of created, or there were issues around the fire exits themselves. There was an issue with the cladding that was around the building itself, which meant that it was incredibly flammable, and it was a lot quick. It took a lot less time for the whole building to be set on fire and to keep burning. Also, various other safety measures that should have been in place were not there. And the more that people dug into it afterwards, this became a real issue as well of justice, in finding out that this building had been poorly managed, and at times had been poorly managed even when there was knowledge that this was a risk. This wasn't just a case of somebody poorly managed it through incompetence alone. This was often willful, where people high up, particularly some politicians, knew that this was substandard and this was a potential risk, and yet it continued to not be funded or supported. And so as a result, we saw this incredible tragedy, this real tragic loss of life from a community that was just completely gutted, and a community that was often made up of some of the lowest earners or some of the most vulnerable people in society. All of this happening, you know, in the fifth richest country or sixth richest country in the world, in its capital city, you know, one of the richest cities in the world. And so many things came out of this that really exposed the heart of corruption. And what I think this book does incredibly well is document all of that. It not only tells the real human stories of the people who lost their lives or the people who only barely made it out. The book also really digs into the politics of this and the kind of the missed opportunities to make something different happen. And it's done in such a startlingly clarifying way. This book is angry because it should be, because we all should be, because this is an absolute tragedy. But it also tells these really powerful stories about who these people were and gives them the grace of being noticed. The end part of this book is a list of all the names of the people who lost their lives. And whereas this book sounds incredibly dark, and obviously it is because of the nature of what happened, I think this book is also such a brilliant testimony to the injustices that often lurk just around the corner in many of our cities, and is also a really vital way of seeking justice. And I think it's just a brilliant book for that. On a significantly lighter note after that, just to sort of bring the mood back to something nicer, Hi Honey, I'm Homo by Matt Baume. And Matt Baume is a YouTuber who I've been following for a while and really love. He does these really incisive and insightful video essays into popular culture, particularly around TV, and how queer representation in those media allowed for a wider social conversation around LGBTQIA plus issues. And whereas at first this sounds like that might be a bit more frivolous, like, yay, this fun thing happened on a TV show, I think Matt Baume's real strength is the way that he's able to both really respect television as a medium and, you know, really talk about it with love and with care, but also acknowledge the absolute silliness of what is going on. So for example, the Golden Girls, a personal favorite of mine, appears in this book, and he talks really lovingly about what those characters were doing on screen, but also very powerfully about what that then led to in terms of the wider conversations. He brings up things like Modern Family as well. He brings up various other TV shows, particularly US ones, and what that meant for the wider public. And actually, it's something that we don't often think about. You know, we think, oh, you know, it's really great to see more queer representation or more representation of whatever group on television, but you don't often think about what that means for those conversations. Sometimes it's easy to dismiss of, oh, it's another gay character on TV, but we maybe don't always think about what that means, and how actually so many people, their first exposure to either someone who looks like them or who lives a similar life and has a similar experience to them, or those of a family and friend, often those first exposures are through things like television. And it's really fascinating, this book, I think, in terms of taking it both very seriously and really understanding the huge social impact that can have, but also understanding that it can be a fun throwaway line by Fran Drescher, and how it can be both things at the same time. And that's what I think is really beautiful about what this book pokes at. And I also think Matt Baume is just a brilliant orator and narrator for these kinds of stories. He loves television, he loves these characters, but he's also not afraid to be critical of them too. And I think that's his real strength, and I think that really comes out in this wonderful book. Next up, Late Light by Michael Malay. And this is a book that I just really fell into and just loved. I sort of discovered it a bit almost by accident. I saw it being available on like I think Borrow Box, and I was like, sure, let's give this a little go. And I think what then came up for me was just this really stunning book that just really delved into some really powerful things. So Michael Malay uses conversations about nature to really focus on identity. And so he talks about himself having come to the UK, and how, you know, being an outsider to the UK means that he's not only got a different perception of what nature might look like, but he is also, in his own way, a sort of a foreign creature that is trying to adapt to the local flora and fauna. And there's something already, I thought, that was very interesting about what he does with that. But then he uses it to explore far broader conversations in a really astute and interesting way. So he talks, for example, about the hostile environment, which was a policy, or at least the sort of direction from Theresa May when she was the Home Secretary. And without getting too much into the politics of this was essentially a conversation that we should be creating a hostile environment for people migrating to the UK. And this was to sort of drive down immigration numbers, but it was done in such a, in my opinion, lackadaisical and slapdash way, where it was just a statement that was immigrants equal bad, and didn't really focus on the conditions that people needed to thrive. And Michael Malay draws a really fascinating link from that to how we treat foreign wildlife, and how there are certain bits of wildlife that we quite happily accept and we think, oh, that's very cute, let's put it in a zoo, and others where we talk about these invasive species. And he does such a clever job of talking about those politics without being particularly heavy on it. And I think it's a real light touch in a very clever way. And whereas this book sounds like it's going to be entirely political, there's so much joy and beauty in the way that he talks about finally coming to see the UK potentially as his home, and doing that through looking at nature and finding his place within nature. And so I just think, for a relatively short book, there's a lot going on that I just think is so clever and perceptive, and really challenged my thoughts on how we perceive nature and who owns it, or who, you know, what our role is in relation to it. And I just thought it was very, very well done, and a really beautiful book in so many ways. Next up, 12 Words for Moss by Elisabeth Jane Burnett, keeping on the nature theme here. And Elisabeth Jane Burnett is a poet, typically, and it shows in this nonfiction book because the writing of this is so beautiful. She talks really candidly and thoughtfully in this book about nature and loss, not only the loss of habitat, but she is going through the process of thinking about her own relationship to grief and mourning. And the way she approaches that is partly by also thinking about nature and how nature goes through cycles, and how things like moss are these sort of ever-present bits of nature that are just there. We think, you know, we just see them as a thing that's there, but the more you dig more closely into what they're doing, they're part of this whole cycle of life for a forest, or for whatever bit of land it's near. And moss therefore has this really important role, even if it doesn't seem like the most important or interesting or sexy thing. But actually, what I think this book does so beautifully, apart from just being incredibly written, is delving into how we think about cycles of nature, how we think about cycles of life and death, how we think about all these other things, and the real sort of healing impact or effect that nature can have on us. And she writes just so beautifully about what that means to her to go out and explore this rare form of moss or what have you, and feel rejuvenated or renewed, or like she has a wider sense of purpose in the world because she's been right up close against the soil, trying to understand what's going on there. I just think it's a beautiful, beautiful book. And last but not least, the most recent addition to this list and to my sort of reading, given that I finished reading it a few days ago at the point of filming this, and I was worried at first that meant that it was too soon, that I was sort of recency bias was at hand here. But I really loved this book and I thought it was really clever, and that's Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. And Naomi Klein is, I think, already a really insightful and interesting writer. She writes often about things like the climate crisis or political corruption or the economy and various other things. And somebody else who also writes a lot of nonfiction about similar but slightly different topics is Naomi Wolf. And the two names already suggest where this is going, given that the book's called Doppelganger. But essentially what happened is Naomi Wolf, a few years older than Naomi Klein, wrote a really sort of big and impactful book called The Beauty Myth in the 90s. And it went on to be this huge, huge book. And Naomi Wolf became this really established writer from it. However, in more recent years, Naomi Wolf has taken a sort of slide towards slightly further right politics and speaking points in a way that feels so alien in some ways to what she used to write about. And Naomi Klein, whenever this happens, gets tagged in it because people have confused the two Naomis. And so what Naomi Klein is doing in this book is not only sort of reminding people that she is not Naomi Wolf, she's also doing a very thorough deep dive about this idea of doppelgangers, what it means to have somebody out there who is in some ways like you or perceived to be like you, but is a very, very different person. And in Naomi Klein's sense as well, and in her experience, her whole brand of who she is as a person is being impacted by Naomi Wolf, because every time Naomi Wolf goes on a far right rant, people think that it is Naomi Klein, and therefore Naomi Klein, who also criticizes big government interference or data breaches or what have you, is actually implicit in or complicit in everything that's going on. So it's not really just a case of her clearing her name, really. I think what this book does really powerfully is then take that concept and explore it more deeply. So it looks at almost the sort of hypernormalization process or the kind of misinformation process that often are employed by the far right. Or sort of neoconservative sort of factions, I guess. So, for example, she talks about people like Steve Bannon in the US and how his podcast will start to co-opt some of the language that's often used by leftist progressive circles, like othering, and will use it to describe their own experiences in a way that then starts to problematize the very word itself, and almost in its usage then means that there's a sort of counter narrative to what is going on in progressive circles or what have you. And I think she does this really cleverly, Naomi Klein. She is clearly incredibly well read and thoughtful, and she does quite a lot in this book where she really explores the perspective of people who are not like her. So like listening to Steve Bannon's podcasts, sort of in an attempt to understand Naomi Wolf. But I think what's also so powerful is Naomi Klein here writes really both angrily and forcefully about certain topics, but also shows a really beautiful amount of empathy and an attempt to understand Naomi Wolf. You know, not just assuming that Naomi Wolf has gone far right and we can just call her evil or what have you. They're actually trying to understand the processes that lead somebody to become either radicalized in a broad sense, you know, radicalized in any direction, or that lead people to feel like their normal, their default positions aren't good enough, and therefore they should start to court the politics of people who they hate or dislike or disagree with. And so this book just becomes this really interesting discussion about so many things. And I just thought it was really, really well done. I think it's just, Naomi Klein is just such a fascinating person. I think she'll often do these things where she writes something and will just completely flip what I'm thinking about something, or really take something I've been wrangling with and just find the words for it. And I just think it's very, very good. So anyhow, those have been the books, the non-fiction books that I've loved most this year. These are only 5 of them. These are just the ones I have physically. But I think, if they sound interesting to you, I urge you to check them out. I think they're all fascinating and really interesting books in a broad range of areas. There are so many other incredible non-fiction books that I've probably no doubt, completely have passed over me at some point this year. Non-fiction is one of those ones where sometimes I really catch it and I find these books that I am just completely head over heels in love with. Sometimes I only find them a few years later because I read a lot of fiction. But I do urge you to check them out. A sort of an honourable mention which I am still listening to at the time of filming this, is Barbara Streisand's memoir, which I think is an exceptionally done memoir. She's clearly thought it out and researched it herself. She has spent a lot of time really thinking about what she wants to say, and really tells a very in-depth story of her own life in a way that could never have been done by a ghostwriter. This is clearly a labour of love. It's about 1,000 pages long as well. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. So I would also recommend Barbara Streisand's memoir, but that's an extra little one. Anyway, I've been Bod Booker, talking about some of my top reads from the year, particularly non-fiction. I'd love to hear your thoughts too. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.